I had an opportunity to come across yet another hoard of vintage silver bars, and it was a pretty exciting thing. And I had just had a hoard of silver come into my collection last year. That's the Lydian Hoard, and I'll put a link down to that series below so you can see what it is that I'm talking about. This hoard I dubbed the Springfield Hoard of vintage silver bars. And that's what this two-part video series is about. The first part of this video series is going to be kind of the thought processes that I used to get involved in this, but also walking back a step, how I encountered this in the first place, this hoard in the first place, and what I used as kind of my techniques to evaluate the pieces that are included in this hoard. And I thought that that was interesting enough that maybe I should shoot a video about that and not so much just about the silver bars. So this will be a two-part video series. The first one really deals with the technical aspects of it, the technology that I use to come to these conclusions, my thought processes that I used in order to select the bars from this hoard that I was going to add to my personal stack. I get asked all the time, how did you make that decision? Why did you pick this over that? So I'm going to give you a little bit of an insight into those processes that I used regarding the Springfield hoard of vintage silver bars. And then in part two, that'll be the fun one. That's where we actually go over these individual pieces that I picked, big, nice, chunky pieces of silver. That's the fun eye candy part. And if you want to skip over this part, I totally get it, right? Not everybody cares about White Cross's thought processes when it comes to determining the value of silver bullion. But I think this is pretty interesting. This is a great case study. And like I said, it gives you a little bit of insight into how I make these determinations. If you are new to the channel, my name is White Cross. And you can call me White, you can call me Dub C. I answer to pretty much anything. And if you are new to the channel, haven't yet subscribed, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel, become part of this community. Go ahead and click on that subscription button now before you forget about it. If you're one of my returning subscribers, thanks guys for being with me here again today. This is kind of a cool journey. I think you're going to dig this. This is a lot of fun. Stay with me if you want to. I get it if you want to skip over to part two and just see the silver. I totally understand. If you're new to the channel, I like to begin each of my videos with a simple disclaimer. That disclaimer is that I am not a financial advisor. I'm not trying to offer any kind of financial advice. I'm simply trying to share some of my experience having bought and sold precious metals and rare coins for the last 30 or 40 years now. And I also like to begin each of my videos with a concept that we can kind of fold back into what we're talking about. And the concept I'm going to hit you with this time is a really simple one. It's just serial numbers. We don't talk about those often enough. And I know that there's a segment within the precious metal stacking community that doesn't want any of their precious metals tracked. They want to lose those metals over the side of a boat in a boating accident. And I kind of get that, but to me, the benefits to serial numbers are so greater compared to the pitfalls of having serial numbers on your gold. I just wanted to talk about them a little bit, not only for the technical standpoint of it, but I think they also play a part in my decision-making process on which pieces I'm going to pick up. So serial numbers. These were probably originally assigned by the refineries, and people have been using serial numbers for probably thousands of years. They're just a way to track inventory, especially when you're talking about something like 10-ounce silver bars that all start to look identical, right? If you're pouring them, you're stamping them with your company's name on them, it's hard to tell them apart. But the last thing you want to do is lose a few ounces or even a few grams of platinum or gold or silver. So you're assigning these serial numbers so you can track these items within your own databases, within your own files. And, this is just an example of what I'm talking about. That's a serial number down here below. The people that were selling bullion, people that continue to this day to sell bullion, not necessarily the refiners themselves, but if they're selling them to a third party that turns around and sells them, they probably want to track these items as well, right? They want to know when they bought them, how much they paid for them, and when they shipped them out. Serial number comes in really handy for that kind of situations too. But for me as the end user, they have the importance of aiding you while you're tracking your pieces. But again, they also aid in determining which pieces you're going to pick up. So I have Excel files for pretty much everything that I collect. So whether it's coins or precious metals or anything else that I collect. And those Excel files contain notes about when I bought a piece, why I bought the piece, how much I paid for it, all of that type of information. And also it allows me to track those individual pieces. And just like those refiners and resellers, I tend to have duplicates of a lot of pieces. You can see there's 3 different of the same type of Engelhard bar here. So those serial numbers allow me to differentiate one from the next. And that's important when it comes to things like how much profit you make if you were to sell something, or how much precious metals you have dollar value based on the spot price on that particular day. It also aids in taxes when you're talking about reporting your gains and all that kind of stuff. And kind of as an aside, if you have these numbers registered, if you've got them logged into an Excel file, and God forbid something happens to your precious metal stack and it goes missing, in order for you to be able to prove that these were your bars to either the insurance company or a cop, the police, to be able to turn over an Excel file that just lists the serial numbers when those bars are found in a bag under a bridge somewhere, you've got that instant recognition. Of course, these are your pieces, and those law enforcement officials or whatever else is going to turn those over to you. You're going to get them back. So yeah, sure, there's, if you want to file off the serial numbers, I kind of get it, but I think the benefits are so much greater. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. We'll talk about how serial numbers do play a role in my decisions for which pieces to pick up. So all of that out of the way, let's get to the good stuff. A few days ago, I was out running errands, and I got a text and a call from one of my local dealers. This dealer knows that they can text me anytime they want. I'll try to respond if I can. They were having issues with silver bars not reading on the sigma where you would have expected them to. So I was only about a mile away, so I just changed course and I got to the shop in about 5 minutes. Now, it was my understanding that the person that was there who had brought these bars in was an heir to an estate. And this looked like it was going to be a pretty big number of silver bars, 10-ounce silver bars. And I made a video recently, that 3,000 subscriber giveaway, where I talked about some of the things that I do when I'm in a coin shop or a resale shop. And this was specifically an answer to a question, how you let one of your dealers know that you're interested in picking up specific things. In this case, it was vintage poured silver bars, but it could really be anything, any type of dealer, any kind of collectible. And I ticked off several things that I try to do. And it all kind of came back to, there were points like try to make yourself as small as possible, get out of the way as soon as you can. If they've got a lot of people in the shop, come back a little bit later. If you've made an obligation to purchase something, live up to that obligation, pay for that, because that dealer has put themselves out by reserving something for you. And if you ever can, send that dealer business. The entire idea is that this is kind of a symbiotic relationship. You want the dealer to be successful, and the dealer's success will ultimately help you be successful. Ben Franklin was famous for having said, to be esteemed, be useful. That's one of my favorite quotes. It's something I try to live by. But the famous American thespian Patrick Swayze said essentially the same thing in his great piece, Roadhouse, where he said, be nice, right? Be nice. And I think that that's words to live by. So that's kind of where I was coming from. Literally, I walked in the shop. I saw this individual. Now, it was just the dealer and this other individual. There was nobody else in the shop. And I made a point of trying to be friendly and greeting this person, saying hello to them. And the bars that were giving my dealers fits were these C and P prefix 12th series Engelhard bars. And I'd never heard of the Sigma failing these pieces before. So I was definitely intrigued. The first thing that I did when I walked up was to ask this individual if I could pick up these bars, right? They weren't my dealers. My dealer hadn't made the purchase yet. And you have to put yourself in the kind of the situation of somebody that's in the shop. You don't know if this person is familiar with coin shops. In this case, they didn't really look like your typical person that comes into a coin shop. I didn't want to make any, just off the cuff evaluations of this individual, but I put myself in their shoes. This was clearly a large group of silver bars. So we're talking about a pretty substantial amount of money. And the last thing I wanted to have them do is to be scared of the fact that I was going to touch their pieces. So I asked them, and they said, sure, absolutely. So right there, I had already gained a data point. And this is really about the collection of data points that comes to eventually lets us come to a conclusion. We knew that these bars weren't reading on the Sigma where they were supposed to. So my first order of business was to pick them up. And by doing that, I was hefting them. I was seeing if they felt right in my hands. And I can't emphasize just how significant that can be. I've got several of these. These bars are from my own stack, so I am familiar with these 12th series bars. They looked fine. They felt fine in my hand. Some of them were in the original vinyl, some of them out of the vinyl. Probably about a dozen of these bars in total. The surfaces looked correct, and you can see that these are stamped on the back of them. They had every indication that looked correct. So far I'm collecting more and more data points, right? The next thing that I did, and the real reason why I wanted to pick these up, is because I wanted to compare them to each other. We had some bars that had registered correctly where they were supposed to, where you would have expected them to read on the Sigma. So I picked up one of those bars, and unfortunately I don't have any unwrapped 12th series bars, but I'll illustrate with these other little pieces of junk silver that I have, these International Vaults bars. Two pieces that were outside of their vinyl. One was a good piece, one was one of these pieces that was questionable. And I put them right up against each other. And by doing that, I can take a comparison both visually, but also texturally. I'm able to feel across the divides between these. Is there any kind of indication that one of these bars is larger? More jagged? Is there anything that's giving me any kind of indication that these seams is not as seamless as it should be? And there wasn't. And I think that's a really important data point as well. So far we knew that compared to bars that were reading correctly, these bars that were reading incorrectly felt just fine. The heft was right, the verbiage was right, the font was right, the look was right, the feel is right against these bars that we know are good. That's a lot of data. So we tried it on the Sigma so I could see exactly what my dealer was seeing. And we'll try to replicate some of this just to give you an illustration. And of course, it never works the way it's supposed to when you're shooting a video, but we're going to give it a shot anyway. And this is a bit of a primer for using the Sigma. With the Sigma, you tell the Sigma what you think you have, and it either agrees or disagrees. That's the easiest way to explain what a Sigma is if you're not familiar with it. We were just in the gold settings, and we've worked our way down to the silver settings. The first silver setting is 99.99% pure. That's a setting that I rarely use because so much bullion is 99.9%, and really I don't care about that 100th of a percent, right? That's not really that big of a deal. So I'm going to go on to 99.9% pure. And when you're testing a silver bar, I'm going to run calc first. You can see that the Sigma has those two brackets and a black cursor that's right in the middle, right there. Hopefully you can see that just fine on your screen. And for me, if you've seen the videos about the Lydian Hoard, and these 5 pieces came from the Lydian Hoard, I'll put a link down to the Lydian Hoard below. That's a fascinating group of silver bars that I was able to get about a year ago. For me, when I am recording this information in those Excel files that I talked about, I do record the position of that cursor when I test that piece of silver or gold on the Sigma. So this is my Sigma. I've had it for about 7 years now, and I'm pretty familiar with it. You've got 5 spaces between those brackets. You have dead center, which I label as 0. That's the value that I give it. Now, these values are kind of arbitrary. They're just for me to be able to take a kind of a mental snapshot of what I'm looking at. And again, let's try it again. You can see that that is dead center, so this would be 0 in my own Excel files. If it were 1 space to the left, I would give that a value of -1. If it was 2 spaces to the left, that would be a -2. If it were 1 space to the right, outside of dead center there, that 0, it would be a +1, and 2 spaces would be a +2. Now, I don't think Sigma uses those figures for any reason. This is something that I've just kind of developed myself, but I think of it as another data point, right? This is something that I use like the weight of an item. It's really no different to me. It's just one more identifying factor about this particular piece of bullion. If your bar weighs 10.02 ounces, I would record that into my Excel file. And now I can say this bar reads +1 or +2 on the Sigma. It's just another data point. So these bars in particular, and we'll see if we can replicate it. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to, but we're reading outside of those brackets. And you saw it for just a second there. Now these bars, again, these are part of my own stack. So this is not what I was seeing. You can see that this bar is off center. It really needs to be right in the middle of the Sigma. But you see how that cursor is right outside of the brackets. It's only 1 space outside of the bracket. That's what we were seeing in the shop that day. But that was a little bit confusing. I'd never encountered a 12th series bar that read like that. And you can even see when this bar is dead center, it's still a positive 2. It's really close to that cursor. The fact that we can replicate at least this bar being off dead center within those brackets on the sigma gives you an indication that even though I am positive these bars are good, I've had them for probably 20 years, that's kind of what we were facing in the shop. Outside of the bracket, but only one space outside the bracket. Now, when you're testing something with the sigma and it's counterfeit, I mean, if it's just counterfeit and you can tell that this piece is fake, that cursor doesn't even appear. It is off the charts. Typically, it is so far to the right that it buries the needle. You can't even see it. So the fact that these Engelhard bars were just outside of the cursor, they certainly weren't off the chart. You could actually see that just outside the brackets, that cursor was still there. That is telling you something. What is it telling us? Sigma has different ideas of what it might mean, but for me that means that it's not so much a red flag. It's more of a high yellow flag about these silver bars. So continuing with my thought processes. The other thing that I noticed as I approached the counter and was looking at these bars, I was taking a quick note of all the rest of the pieces that were included in the hoard. And I'll show an image of the box that these came in. This is by all means not the entire grouping here. There's many more bars than this, but you get kind of an idea of what we're looking at. So this hoard included several bars that I was familiar with. There were Southeast refining bars. You can see those with the coins on the top, I think, in the image. There were at least one bar by SilverTowne, and there were bars by Wall Street Mint. So these are all vintage bars. I wouldn't call these rare bars. You encounter these with some frequency still to this day. So it's not like I'm saying these are bad bars. These are definitely older vintage bars, but they're just not quite as scarce as some of the other bars that I'm maybe a little bit more interested in. In addition to those, there were quite a few of these C and P prefix 12 series bars. There were a big handful of these Engelhard commercial first series bars and the later bars that actually have the eagle on them instead of the big E there. What was that telling me? That was telling me that this person who had assembled these probably knew, at least to a bit of an extent, that they knew what they were looking for, right? There was nothing in there that would just be like, ooh, why did you pick that up? These were all reputable silver bars, but more important, these bars were all vintage. So all of the pieces that I could see without rummaging through this box, again, I didn't want to make the seller uncomfortable. I just noticed them as I was looking kind of at this hoard. All of these pieces were vintage. So the latest that I saw was probably early 1990s, and that's another data point. This is another thing that I could use in my evaluation. If we've seen a proliferation of fakes of all kinds from Asia, probably in the last 15 or 20 years, but these bars predated that, right? Everything that was included in this group was probably more like 30 years ago. And that's another data point. If there was a bunch of stuff that was brand new and these bars were reading inconsistently, that would be a pretty big red flag. But so far, everything that I saw in this group looked age appropriate. Everything had the right tarnish or patina on it. Everything was by the right manufacturers that were popular in this period of time. Again, the Southeast Refining and Wall Street Mint, those kinds of things. So this data point was telling me that all of these bars were probably assembled before the number of fakes really started to increase. Now, that's certainly not definitive, but you can see how my mind was working. Another data point that was to the positive, that these bars were probably okay. And then I kind of thought to myself about the Sigma that my dealer was using. All Sigmas work a little bit differently. I just had my Sigma retuned by Sigma, so by Metalytics, so I know that mine's working pretty well right now. But it's possible that my dealer hadn't had theirs recalibrated anytime recently. And Sigma comes with this little recalibration disk, so you can kind of bring your unit back down to zero, square it back down to zero periodically, just like any kind of piece of equipment, computer equipment. You just kind of reboot it every once in a while, and that's kind of what the recalibration disks do. You can go through a process to recalibrate. So it's possible that my dealer just hadn't recalibrated recently. The Sigma works on rechargeable batteries. Is it possible that the batteries were just starting to get low, right? So I was just kind of running through those ideas in my head also while I was trying to take in all the rest of these data points. And then I had what I thought was a pretty good idea. Let's go ahead and weigh these. We knew that some of these bars were good, right? They had read on the sigma where they were supposed to. Let's see if these bars weigh what they're supposed to. So we took out the scale and we weighed all of them, the good bars and the bad bars, and they all fell within the parameters of what I would expect for Engelhard. Now, I've talked about what I think is probably Engelhard's philosophy going back 50 years ago. When refiners were first putting out these types of silver bars for consumers, like this International Vaults piece, we can see the weight right here, right? This was something that was, after the bars cooled, they weighed these bars individually, and then somebody had to stamp the weight on those bars individually as well. You can see that that was a pretty time-consuming and labor-intensive process to do for every single one of these bars that walked out of their refinery. And I think Engelhard kind of revolutionized the idea of not caring about that. And what I mean by that is, when you've got Engelhard bars, they don't say 10.07 troy ounces, they say 10 troy ounces. And it's my contention that Engelhard intentionally overweighed their bars. They overbuilt these bars to be fractionally larger than 10 troy ounces. And they sold them as 10 troy ounce bars. And believe me, if you get a bar that's greater than 10 ounces and you paid for 10 ounces, that's great, right? That's almost kind of another form of advertising. That makes your bars stand out from the rest. But I think Engelhard saved so much in labor and time by not having individual weights stamped on their bars that they blew away the costs compared to everybody else. They ate those little tiny fractions of a troy ounce of overweight, and it enabled them to churn out much greater numbers. And we'll talk about some of those numbers a little bit later in this video. So in my experience, when you're weighing an Engelhard bar, rather than 10 troy ounces, it is 10.02. 10.03 troy ounces. Now, those are only hundredths of a troy ounce. And like I said, I think Engelhard probably made up in volume whatever they were losing by adding those to it. And I have never come across an Engelhard bar that was lighter than 10 troy ounces, if that was the stated weight. So I do think that this was intentional, and I think it was really a pretty smart thing for Engelhard to do. Going back to the coin shop that day, we tested every single one of them, and every single one of them, including those bars that had failed the sigma, were exactly where you would expect them to be. 10.01, 10.02, they were spot on. Another data point. So we have collected so many data points up to this point that reading on the sigma is losing some of its significance. It's still an important thing to consider. And that goes back to the point that I was going to make about what I thought was a pretty good idea. Rather than test these at 99.9%, I suggested that we try them at 92.5%. That's the next step down on the sigma. The sigma has set numbers that you can use, set purities that you can use. So rather than 99.9, we set it to sterling 92.5. And my thinking was, if the bar was tested at 92.5 and that cursor just shot off the end of it, then we knew that there was something seriously wrong with these bars. But if it tested within those brackets, if that cursor was within the brackets, then we knew to a pretty high degree that these bars were at least silver. It was going to tell us something. And we tested them all, and they were all spot on, right in the middle of that 0 designation that I've given it, right smack in the dab in the middle of the brackets. What does that tell us? To me, that tells us that that piece is at least sterling silver, and there's a good chance that it's a higher purity than even sterling. Now, unfortunately, we couldn't set it somewhere between the two, somewhere between 99.9 and 92.5. But the strength of the reading at that 92.5 told me that, in my opinion, these bars were solid silver, and they were of a purity at least 92.5 and likely higher than that. So ultimately, my suggestion to my dealer was that while these weren't reading exactly where they probably should be reading, in my opinion, I would be comfortable paying sterling silver for them. And again, this person that was an heir to the estate didn't seem to have any emotional attachment to these pieces. They just saw these as big chunks of money. So if the dealer was ultimately going to pay you 92.5% of the value of the silver rather than 100%, you're not losing that much if you don't have a real vested interest in these pieces, especially if this is really just impacting a small number relative to the rest of this hoard of silver bars that they were going to be buying at full, 10 troy ounce 999 purity. So that was my suggestion, and Following Patrick Swayze's advice, I said goodbye and I exited the store as quickly as possible. I didn't want to muddy the waters. I didn't want to interject myself into the middle of this negotiation, this discussion between my dealer and this customer. It's none of my business. And I was happy to have been included in this. It's kind of flattering to know that your dealers trust you and trust your opinion. And I thought I came up with some pretty good evidence for them. So I'm pretty proud of that. I turned around and left, but as I was leaving, I took one more quick glance at this box of bars, and I noticed there was a bar that I hadn't seen before. And the name of the bar, the maker's mark on that bar, was pretty easy to remember. So I made a mental note of that bar in particular. I went back home, and on the way home, with visions of sugar plums dancing in my head, I started to do a calculation of how much money I could afford to spend on these pieces. So you've seen how I helped evaluate these bars. You see the thought processes that I went to. We're not just relying on the Sigma. I love the Sigma. It's a fantastic piece of technology. But if it's giving you something that is not what you expected, what else can you do? You can use the elements that I am always talking about it. Your sense of heft, your sense of touch, your sense of familiarity with these bars, what they should look like. Thankfully, the bars that we were comparing were outside of these plastic cases, so we could do a weight analysis of them. We used all of these different data points to come to a conclusion, and while it might not have been the wisdom of Solomon, the idea of paying maybe 92.5 rather than full 99.9% pure, I thought it was a great compromise both for the dealer and the customer. All of these attributes went into place. I started figuring out how much money I could afford to make my decisions of which of these bars, assuming that my dealer was able to pick them up, which ones I wanted to add to my stack. So I went home, I did a little bit of research, and I came to the conclusion that I was going to buy exactly, well, you're going to have to wait till the next video. So I told you this was going to be a two-parter. The first part, I wanted to go over the evaluation process that I was able to help with. You've seen kind of peered inside my head and seen the processes that I was able to use, along with my dealer, who is quite knowledgeable and was, at least as responsive to these ideas as I was. They were coming up with these suggestions as well. But I think we combined for some pretty good ideas there. I was able to introduce myself to this individual. I was as polite as I could possibly be. I was able to look over the selection, and this also enabled me to look it over probably before anybody else that my dealer has as customers, and that's a benefit too. There's nothing wrong with that. I made some mental notes of some of the rest of these pieces on the off chance that these pieces were going to come into the shop and I was going to be able to pick them up. And then I exited as quickly as possible, as quietly as possible, so my dealer could make the rest of these negotiations without me being there to muddy the waters. In the next video in this series, I'll talk about the bars that I was able to pick up and exactly why I picked them up, the attributes that I looked at, the things that were attractive to me. But I'll also talk about some of the bars that I left behind. Why did I not pick up this entire collection when I have done that in the past, in the example of the Lydian Hoard? So come back for part 2 if you sat all the way through this. I really appreciate it. I'd love to be able to give you kind of the insight and the techniques that I used when I was evaluating these pieces. And if you like that, you're going to love it when you actually see the big chunky results. If you have any questions about the techniques that I used, by all means, leave that question down below. As you know, I like to say, if you've got a question, chances are other people have that question too. Let's see if we can answer it for everybody. If you have any suggestions of other videos you'd like to see me make based on the techniques that I used here, by all means, leave that question down below also. If you haven't yet subscribed, go ahead and click on that subscription button, click on that like button, and click on the notification buttons, all that kind of good stuff too. I'd like to have you be part of this community. And as always, thank you for allowing me to be a part of your journey as we go deeper into the world of coins and physical precious metals.